Welcome to Newsday, reporting live from Singapore. I'm Karishma Vaswani. The headlines. In Afghanistan, the Taliban announced their new government. None of the cabinet officials are women, and their new prime minister is on a UN terrorism sanctions list. Earlier, the group fired warning shots on the streets of Kabul as hundreds took part in protests condemning the Taliban and criticizing Pakistan.
This is the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority that we've seen so far, and it's not coming from a militia force, it's coming from peaceful protesters, from both women and men.
President Biden tours New York and New Jersey, seeing the damage caused by Hurricane Ida's flooding and using it to sound the alarm on climate change. Struggling to remember their letters, how India's school children have been hit hard by the COVID pandemic. And Britney Spears' father files a petition to end his controversial 13-year control over her estate. We'll have the latest live from LA.
Live from our studio in Singapore. This is BBC News. It's Newsday.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. Our top story today, the Taliban have announced an interim government. It comes more than 3 weeks after they ousted the Afghan president and took control of most of the country. The head of the interim cabinet is this man, Mohammed Hassan Akhund, who also happens to be on a UN terror sanctions list. Today, hundreds of protesters, many of them women, took to the streets of the capital, Kabul. They were met with warning shots from the Taliban. Sekunder Kermani reports from Kabul.
Death to Pakistan, the crowd chant. They're furious at what they believe is the country's support for the Taliban, including, they allege, in taking over Panjshir, the last province to be captured by the group.
Pakistan has directly attacked our country. We don't want Pakistan to announce the government here. Afghanistan is a free country. We women and men are not the same as those 20 years ago who were being whipped into submission.
But Pakistan says the Taliban are Afghan. It's got nothing to do with them.
I accept the Taliban are Afghans, but behind them is Pakistan. They gave them this ideology.
Pakistan says it's always worked for peace in Afghanistan. Taliban members initially appear to allow the protesters to march through the city.
This is the biggest challenge to the Taliban's authority that we've seen so far, and it's not coming from a militia force, it's coming from peaceful protesters, from both women and men.
And amongst the protesters, some not afraid to directly criticize the group.
We demand freedom of speech, democracy, national resistance against the Taliban.
Aren't you afraid?
We are not afraid of death. We are the young generation and will bring the bud of freedom. Our voices will make history.
At a Taliban press conference, the group rejected what they termed propaganda about Pakistan's influence. This evening, they finally announced their new government, naming Mullah Haibatullah Emir or supreme leader of the country, Mullah Hassan Akhund as caretaker prime minister, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, wanted by the FBI, as Minister of Interior.
There's no women in the cabinet. What message do you think that sends out?
We haven't announced all the ministries and deputies yet, so it's possible this list will be extended.
Back at the protest, convoys of Taliban vehicles made their way to the site. Eventually, fighters fired shots in the air to disperse the crowd. Dissent is not something the Taliban is used to. Sekunder Kermani, BBC News, Kabul.
Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Madiha Afzal. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, and she's been following the situation in Afghanistan very closely.
This is the furthest thing from an inclusive cabinet for this interim cabinet that the Taliban have announced. And the Taliban say that international recognition matters to them, but And its words certainly are designed to placate the international community, but its actions are quite different from its words, including this announcement of this cabinet, and its actions say otherwise. I think the Taliban may, in fact, be able to gain some recognition even without an inclusive government, though, especially from countries that it's been close to, China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar.
When you talk about the international recognition, in the cabinet lineup, though, you've got Sirajuddin Haqqani, head of a militant group known as the Haqqani Network, wanted by the US State Department. He's now the Interior Minister. How do other governments navigate the issue of working with the Taliban in this way?
I think this puts the U.S. certainly in a very difficult position. I don't see the U.S. Engaging with a Taliban government in which Sirajuddin Haqqani is a part of that government. So I think that certainly puts the U.S. in a difficult position. I do think that there are certain governments, right? So the Taliban may be able to gain, I think it's more regional recognition rather than international recognition. It may be more sort of thinking about these countries that I mentioned rather than Western recognition. So I don't think it's the entire international community engaging with this government. I think it's going to be sort of a part of the international community.
Right. Yeah, Madiha, on that regional recognition, Pakistan, of course, one of the countries that you mentioned, and yet there have been anti-Pakistan protests in the country, haven't there? Some speculation that they funded and supported the Taliban. How much influence does Pakistan really have now?
Sure. Well, Pakistan's support for the Taliban in the 1990s was crucial for the Taliban. It was sort of part of Pakistan's whole strategy of strategic depth, a friendly government on its western border. And post-2001, Pakistan's sanctuaries for the group have really played a crucial role in the group being able to regroup and launch its insurgency. And in fact, Pakistan's own interior minister talked about the fact that the Taliban's families live in Pakistan, and the Taliban have received medical care and they come and go from Pakistan. So, there's some recognition and acknowledgement of that from the Pakistani government as well. And so, there's anger at that. Coming from Kabul and coming from various, from Afghans all over the country. And of course, the DGISI's recent visit has inflamed tensions. There's also a fair bit of propaganda and fake news that inflames tensions, but the basic case of Pakistan's support for the Taliban is something that Afghans feel very strongly about. Right. And that is going to certainly play a role in sort of a resistance, I think, to the Taliban in the future.
Madiha Afzal there from the Brookings Institution. Well, if you want to know more about the interim Taliban government, just go to our website where you'll find more details on who's in the cabinet, as Madiha and our correspondent Sekunder Kermani were talking about just a little earlier. Well, we can take a look at some of the other stories in the headlines today. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been hit by gravel thrown by protesters during a campaign stop. He was returning to his bus after visiting a brewery when he was pelted by gravel, although he wasn't injured. Mr. Trudeau called a snap election in mid-August in the hope of gaining a majority government for his Liberal Party. Angela Merkel has addressed a regular session of the German Parliament for the last time as Chancellor before her successor is elected later this month. She's been in office for 16 years. During an unusually heated debate, Angela Merkel used the event to campaign for her chosen candidate for Chancellor, Conservative leader Armin Laschet, who is doing badly in the polls. Mexico's Supreme Court has ruled that criminal penalties for terminating pregnancies are unconstitutional, a decision which could lead to the decriminalization of abortion across the country. In a unanimous ruling, the top court ordered the northern state of Coahuila to remove sanctions for abortion from its criminal code, a move which will set a precedent across Mexico. The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, has signed into law an overhaul on voting rights that introduces sweeping changes to ways Texans can cast ballots. The bill marks a bitter defeat for Democrats who had fled the state in July in an effort to prevent it from passing. The law includes a ban on 24-hour polling places and adds ID requirements to vote by mail. 2 men are in custody following an armed robbery on a Bulgari store in Paris. 3 suspects fled in a car while the others escaped on scooters. One of the men was later arrested after he was shot in the leg by police. The thieves made off with around $12 million in jewelry. A manhunt is underway for the remaining suspects. Meanwhile, President Biden has been in New York and New Jersey surveying the damage caused by Tropical Storm Ida. Ida first slammed into Louisiana as a Category 4 hurricane more than a week ago, then became a tropical storm as it deluged the Northeast. More than 60 people died across 8 states. In New Jersey, heavy rain and catastrophic flooding killed 27 people and took the lives of 17 in New York. Here's what Mr. Biden had to say a little earlier.
We've got to listen to the scientists and the economists and the national security experts. They all tell us this is code red. The nation and the world are in peril. That's not hyperbole. That is a fact. They've been warning us the extreme weather would get more extreme over the decade, and we're living in real time now.
President Biden there. Well, if you want to get in touch with me on any of the stories that you've seen on Newsday so far, the situation in Afghanistan, for instance, I'm on Twitter at BBC Karishma. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme. It's time to play the music. It's time to light the lights. We'll be hearing from Ralph the dog, one of Jim Henson's Muppets, about why his creator is being honoured with a blue plaque at his former London home.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning, and freedom will be defended. The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible.
Bishop Tutu now becomes spiritual leader of 100,000 Anglicans here, of the blacks in Soweto Township as well as the whites in their rich suburbs.
We say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
The difficult decision we reached together was one that required great and exceptional courage.
It's an exodus of up to 60,000 people caused by the uneven pace of political change in Eastern Europe.
I am free!
This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. Our headlines. The Taliban have announced their new government in Afghanistan. There are no women, and their new prime minister is on a UN terrorism sanctions list. Earlier, Taliban fighters fired shots into the air to disperse protesters in Kabul. Hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets, many of them women. Well, in other stories today, much of New Zealand eases a strict lockdown Wednesday morning. Residents outside Auckland will be allowed to return to work and school. The country has been chasing a zero-COVID strategy, enforcing severe restrictions on movement and activities. The elimination strategy has been popular in many other parts of Asia, although some countries have talked about living with the virus and loosening measures. It's been the Delta variant which has proved much more difficult to contain, although the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has continued her support for zero-COVID policies. Well, Michael Baker is Professor of Public Health at the University of Otago and explained how we got to this point in New Zealand.
New Zealand's pursued an elimination strategy since the start of the pandemic, since March last year. I mean, this has been very successful in preventing widespread circulation of the virus in New Zealand. We've had 27 deaths over this period. we've had very little time under lockdown, and the economy has performed very well. But as you point out, in the Asia-Pacific region, the Delta variant emergence has really strained this strategy. And of course, we've had 3 weeks now with battling a Delta variant outbreak in New Zealand. It's concentrated in Auckland. We appear to be winning. The numbers have dropped down now to 20 cases a day in Auckland, which is still under an intense lockdown, but the rest of the country is emerging into a situation where we have very few restrictions now. And I think we will actually fully eliminate this virus again in New Zealand.
Is your sense then that lockdowns do work against the Delta variant, despite the fact that it is so much more contagious than its predecessor?
Yeah, well, the model that New Zealand has used very successfully is to have a very rapid, intense lockdown as soon as you see any cases. And that has worked before for us, and it's working well now. It's just a bit tougher against this far more infectious variant. But I'm certain we will actually return to an elimination state after this.
Michael, the picture that you're painting then means that people are basically going to be living in lockdown for the indefinite future. What about the vaccination strategy? Why aren't more people in New Zealand vaccinated?
Well, we had supply constraints with vaccination. It's now rolling out very rapidly. We have over 60% of the eligible population now had one or more doses of the Pfizer vaccine. I'm sure we will get over 80% within the next 6 weeks to 8 weeks in this country. So the strategy is to continue with elimination. We've had very little time under lockdown in the last 18 months, get high vaccine coverage, and then cautious reconnecting with the world after that. So that will mean, in a very controlled way, allowing more people to enter New Zealand.
And Michael, just briefly, does that mean that once vaccinations are at the level that you want them to be, then that means that there won't be lockdowns, that social restrictions will end?
Well, the social restrictions have been very limited in New Zealand for most of the last 18 months. We've used lockdowns very selectively. This is only the second national lockdown we've had in that 18-month period. We had one right at the start to eliminate the virus. So basically, we've had a high degree of freedom. But yes, when we reconnect with the world more and have a lot more people coming across the border in a situation of high vaccine coverage, we will hopefully avoid the need for lockdowns in those situations.
That was Professor Michael Baker from the University of Otago in New Zealand there. Well, I want to bring you some breaking news at this hour. 3 members of the Standing Committee of the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China have been arrested this morning. That's according to a BBC correspondent in Hong Kong. Police officials are waiting outside the Vice Chairperson's office to arrest these people. The alliance, which was set up to support the protesters of Tiananmen Square in 1989, has been accused of being a foreign agent under the national security law, of course, which was passed by Beijing last year. There are 5 members on the Standing Committee in total. That breaking news coming in from Hong Kong. As we told you from a BBC correspondent there, we'll be sure to bring you more news as and when we get it right here on BBC World News. Well, moving on to other stories, a UNICEF study on the impact of school closures in India has found that 42% of children reported not using any type of remote learning during the pandemic. The Indian government has rolled out tools for online education, but to very mixed results. As schools finally consider reopening, the BBC's Divya Arya meets some children living through this long shutdown of education.
Radhika and her friends are excited but nervous. They are trying to write after many months. Radhika lifts her tiny chalk, hesitates, and finally writes the wrong letter. The 10-year-old's education has become a casualty of the pandemic. What did they teach you at school? I ask her. A, B, C, D, the Hindi alphabet, and math. They used to teach us everything, she says. Hindi and English were her favorite. Children in this Dalit village in eastern India's Jharkhand do not have access to internet or smartphones. parents are mostly illiterate. With no classes during the pandemic, online or offline, learning has come to a halt. This dilapidated building is the local primary school for children up to the age of 10, and it has been shut for more than 16 months now. And even when these doors open, some children may have been left too far behind to compete and get through school again.
Education, definitely for most poor parents, it's the only hope that their children will have a better life.
Economist Jean Drez is coordinating a survey to understand how underprivileged children have been impacted by the lack of schooling.
The public policy is driven largely by what is called the middle class, but actually it's the privileged classes, a relatively small minority, maybe 20-30% of the population. And this entire policy of complete reliance on online education, that is geared to this so-called middle class. It works well for them. Their children are safe at home.
Sam went out of the barn into...
Like in this home in a Delhi suburb where 7-year-old Prithvira continued to study safely. She is helped by her educated mother and does online classes regularly.
How is having classes online? Good but bad. Good because I can wake up at 7:45 and also sit in my class. And bad that I have to join, not go.
She has also learned dance and the Spanish language, but it's not enough.
I want to go back to school. No. I demand that this lockdown opens.
It's what Radhika told me too. The wide gap between such children has only deepened during the pandemic. When schools feel safe enough to reopen, the challenge would be to bridge this learning divide. Divya Arya, BBC News, Jharkhand.
Well, some other news that's just come in the last hour or so. Jamie Spears, the father of Britney Spears, has petitioned a Los Angeles court to end the pop singer's 13-year conservatorship. The pop superstar has been under conservatorship since 2008, which means she's not been in charge of decisions concerning her own life, career and assets. Ms. Spears has tried more times to overturn the arrangement, and she has filed legal documents asking that her father be immediately removed as the conservator of her $60 million estate. Well, we can get the latest now from our correspondent David Willis in Los Angeles. Great to have you on the program about this story. This seems like a remarkable and unexpected turn for this particular case for Britney Spears. Tell us, what does it mean?
Krishna, this is a major victory not only for Britney Spears but for the Free Britney fans who've been calling for her to be released from the terms of this conservatorship for years now. They've been portrayed as cranks and conspiracy theories. There are claims that Britney Spears was being held against her will under the terms of this conservatorship have been ridiculed. But there was a documentary released earlier in the year which gave credence to a lot of those claims. That heightened the pressure on Jamie Spears, Britney Spears' father, to stand down, to relinquish control over her $60 million estate. It also shored up support for Britney Spears herself, who twice during the summer actually spoke in court to call the conservatorship abusive and to say that she had been coerced into doing things against her will. Well, now we have this extraordinary petition filed today here in Los Angeles, the court, by her father, which basically seeks not only to remove him from the conservatorship, but to bring the conservatorship itself to an end. Now, it will be up to a judge here to approve that, and there is a hearing set for the end of this month, just 3 weeks away. But clearly, this is the beginning of the end and a resounding victory for Britney Spears and her supporters.
Yeah, briefly, David, what does this mean in terms of her career? Will we start to see Britney performing again, being able to do the things that she's talked about that she wants to do?
Well, at one point, she was refusing to perform, of course, all the time that her father remained in control of her estate. She's since intimated that she would like to retire, perhaps, but we'll have to wait and see if this changes her decision. She has, of course, under the terms of the conservatorship, been on tour. She has made a lot of money for the conservatorship from the sale of records, and there's clearly an appetite on the part of fans to see her perform again.
David Willis joining us from Los Angeles with that latest story, the latest news on Britney Spears. Meanwhile, a blue plaque has been installed at the former London home of the Muppets creator Jim Henson. He bought the home in Hampstead at the peak of the Muppets' success at the end of the 1970s. English Heritage unveiled the plaque ahead of what would have been the puppeteer's 85th birthday. Rolf the dog is the first Muppet that worked with Jim. He told my colleague Christian Fraser about his fond memories of time he spent with Jim in London.
You know, we love to take walks together in Hampstead. You know, especially the Heath. We often shared a new leash on life. Occasionally, afternoon tea at Egerton House. He'd have the scones and clotted cream, and well, I'd watch. Lactose intolerant.
Christian has all the fun, doesn't he? I'm going to have to complain to my producers and editors about that. That's it for us on Newsday. Thanks so much for joining us. Do stay with BBC News.